have Chrome Inspector open and I was looking at the network tab, and I just noticed this thing came in. It said content encoding VR, and I'm like, well, that's interesting. So I just kind of went down that rabbit hole, which I guess kind of leads me to today. So really quickly, like what is Brotli? It's Google created an open source replacement for gzip. It actually came out of efforts to reduce font sizes for WAF 2. Then they kind of generalized it, released it. Generally, compared to gzip, you'll get 10 to 20% more compression. It'll vary. Kind of 10 to 20 is what you can realistically expect in any kind of real-world scenario. Some people like to say you should still use gzip for real time, you should use Brotli for static. The reason is like Brotli a little bit slower than gzip, but I've actually got a link to Akamai, I could bring it up. But really what it will say is that it really depends, and it's worth doing some investigation. Both gzip and Brotli have sort of, we'll say, performance curves, so you can kind of play around with the ratio of compression to amount of time you want it to run for. What I was interested in using Brotli for was static asset compression. So it's a build step. We don't care how long it runs for. Some of us might care, but I don't care. So it'll just run, and then once that build step's done, those assets exist in the compressed state until you're ready to deploy production again. I personally think it's something worth doing, which kind of brings me to this bullet point. And I'll share the slides with everyone because it's kind of hard to share this link, but what it is a bit of an essay by one of the engineers at Google, and I paraphrased the quote because it was actually originally about gzip. We said compression is the simplest and highest payoff optimization to implement. And they actually talk about how you can go about looking at how your performance relates to conversion rates, and therefore how much money is your company losing as a result of how quickly your page can load. So obviously, reducing the size of what you need to send over the wire is going to lead to quicker renders. Time to first paint decreases. And this link here, Bundlephobia, is an interesting website where, like, if you're concerned about size of packages, you can actually take a look at, just see how big this is actually going to increase your payload. So something like Vue, pretty small, 60 kilobytes, and if I didn't use it, 21. There was actually one that was worse than Babel. I think Moment.js.
Oh no! Let me have someone's face in What's the one that has someone's face in the code?
Oh, that was just a satire piece. But a really good satire piece.
Okay.
that was
one of the
fire something. But anyways. Anyway,
Yeah.
it was a satire piece, but oh, sorry, I'm just thinking fire because it's Guy Fieri's face. That's who it was, but it was Vue.js maybe. That was the joke. But
Okay.
Yeah. Anyway, very believable.
One of the things that the site calls out to is sort of not everybody has gigabit internet. Realistically, a lot of people are consuming content on their phone. They might have an LTE connection, or they might be on the outskirts of town and have really spotty 3G. That's going to impact this a lot. And actually, because of Google's clout and the fact that they control Android, that's sort of where Brotli kind of entered the scene originally. You can find that on the Wikipedia page. So things to consider before you go all in. I didn't really think about these things ahead of time, so this is sort of the benefit of my going through this for everyone here. I just thought it would be really cool to offer gzip and Brotli. And turns out, if you're not concerned about legacy browser support, that's perfectly all right. and depending on your CDN setup, it's probably all right as well. So the things to consider are really like, what is your data? I think I saw someone try to use gzip on a GIF. That's not going to work. Something that's already compressed, like WAF2, you can actually end up with worse performance or inflate the size of your asset. So generally, anything that's text-based, CSS, JS, HTML, a couple of different fonts, and obviously JSON. And then does it suit your use case? So static assets is what I was looking at. Another thing that we've done here as well is caches. So if you're storing something in Redis and it's not compressed, you're spending a lot of money. If you can compress your JSON by 70%, you're getting 70% more cache. That's a pretty sweet win. And then another thing you might want to consider for would be logs. If you're not already using an external service provider, even then, depends on how they bill you. It's sort of a no-brainer. So yeah, can your customers accept it? Again, generally, yes. That represents something like 98% of the world is able to accept Brotli encoded assets. Then the two other questions are not so straightforward to answer. So can your backend serve it? Well, if it's Rails, it can't. And there's lots of ways around that. A lot of companies might use something like Nginx to serve their assets. Rails, I mean, they don't compress Brotli, so it doesn't actually make a lot of sense for them in middleware say, is this a Brotli asset? But if you're doing a lot of stuff with Grunt or Webpack, odds are you might be interested in doing this like I was. So that's kind of why I thought it would be nice to add that to Rails. And then can your CDN fetch it from your backend? That's another thing we'll get into. So at a very high level, this is how it works. You just have a web user who make a request to your server, and the server is always going to send along an accept encodings header, and it's generally gzip deflate br. Server will get the request or your cache or something like Fastly or CDN, and it'll say, if I have anything that fits this criteria, if I have a gzip asset, I'll return that back. And I'm going to make sure I set this content encoding header. Some other headers you're going to want to set would be content type, and that has to do with using something like Webpack, because what often will happen is your asset would be file name dot .json.gz, and it would look at the file extension and it'll say, actually, sorry, when you're compressing it, it'll look at the file extension if, sorry guys, I'm drawing a blank because I'm like going into more detail than I was expecting to at this point.
That's okay.
When it's setting content type, it'll look at a file extension. If your content, if your file extension is .dr or .gz, it doesn't know what the file is. It can't actually set it. So it's something that you'll often want to manage yourself, or just some hacks around what you send to your library that sets content and type. The other header would be vary, and that's what the CDN is going to alter requests based on. So if you were just sending up an asset and there's no encoding, that's fine. You can always respond with the same asset. If you have a gzip version and a Brotli version, you don't want to send back the Brotli version if someone doesn't support accept encoding. So what vary says is treat all of these requests different based on accept encoding or whatever else, because you can just specify the header to vary, so you can take a variety of arguments. So this is just some code for compressing with Webpack. It's the simplest thing. So it's pretty much exactly what you'd see if you were using Webpack to compress something as gzip. So just the key would be to use a whitelist, and then that way you control what is being compressed. And then you can send a variety of options to the Brotli compressor. You're probably only concerned with quality, so it's a number between 0 and 11, and that's going to just, how much time do you want to spend compressing the asset. Generally, if it's a real-time thing, probably quality 4. I think that's what the NPM shrink rate package uses by default. So yeah, in a real-time situation, probably 4. If it's a static asset, set it to 11. In Vidyard, every single pull request has to have a GIF associated with it. This was the GIF that I chose when I put my Brotli thing up. So I talked to our director of engineering and I said, can I actually show some code that I wrote internally? He said, sure. I'm not sure if you guys will be able to read it, but this is extremely similar to what would be in the pull request that I sent to Rails. And it's really just inheriting from action dispatch.
Oh, it's going off on the right hand side.
Oh, it just
doesn't show up in suit.
Okay, so yeah, just inherited from action dispatch, and just sort of like set your headers and call super whenever possible. There really wasn't a lot to it. The thing that got hairy was for our particular situation. In Rails middleware, you can insert your code into the middleware stack relatively. So some gem, which I'll bring up their code, did something I was not anticipating, and they said to look for action dispatch static, and that's where they were going to insert themselves. So when I subclassed it and I swapped our action dispatch with my Brotli stuff, that stopped working, and that meant that assets in production, specifically these fonts, weren't getting the course headers set, and the site looked really ugly. Well, we figured out what went wrong. So it's kind of a warning, like be aware of what code that you bring in is actually doing. I think probably all of us are guilty of bringing in a gem and not looking at the code and just treating it like a black box. And you're never really concerned with what it does so long as it appears like it's doing what it should do. I've got other stories too, but that's the font assets story. So again, I'll make the presentation available if anyone wants to go through this code. Again, it's pretty simple, and it boils down to just setting your content encoding, content type, vary headers. So the CDN problem. CDNs don't want to duplicate your data for free. So I had written all of this code, and turned out after talking to Edgecast that they could make it work, but it was going to cost us a bunch of money. And so I went and I talked to our VP of engineering. I said, can I move all of our assets to a different CDN? And he said, okay. That was a real conversation that happened. So we were using Edgecast before. One thing that I really like is working with Fastly, because they'll get back to you within minutes of sending them a question, and they're always really helpful. So when I wanted to compress all of our stack assets with Brotli, I sent them an email, and they're like, yeah, this is actually something that we're going to support more formally in the future, but one of their engineers had some workarounds for getting it in immediately. So I've linked to that here, so you guys can take a look at this thread if this is something you're interested in using. One of the coolest things about Fastly setup is that you can just compress stuff as Brotli, have an uncompressed version, and then if you want, they'll do server-side compression, so they'll give you a gzip version. So then you're not wasting time on your end doing a Brotli version and a gzip version. And it's totally transparent to you. It's just, you just make it available, and as a request comes in, they'll just compress it.
I think you had it clicked down.
Oh. Okay. Getting back to the community. Can I use company time to give away code to Ruby on Rails? Okay. That was a conversation I had with our CTO. Back when we had one-on-ones with our CTO. So that's actually another nice thing about working here, is that if you have an idea, they're very receptive to just saying, yeah, go ahead and do it. So these were my pros and cons that I came up with out of doing this. So make life easier for other people. I think we all use a ton of GPL code or MIT code. And it's always nice to see other people's implementation of the same idea, and also just being able to share like your solution with other people. I think that's probably the greatest thing about being in software, is that you can go to NPM, someone's already thought about this. Very rarely in life are you the first person to encounter a problem. And then the other big advantage would be shifting the maintenance burden. This is maybe something that doesn't happen with smaller or even mid-sized companies. Definitely with larger companies, you create something awesome. It's kind of tangential to your purposes, and you can get the community support for you. As far as maybe individuals and small companies go, I think it's just the learning experience. For me, it was interesting to pull down Rails and see how they build it. They use Vagrant, we use Docker. It's like, well, okay, that's maybe something I wouldn't have thought about in the future. Yeah, that'd be something to consider. Although I kind of do like our Docker setup. And then cons, yeah, it's time consuming. There's always things you want to work on. So rewriting your code and dealing with strangers you've never met before who make requests can be tiresome. The other thing too is that your stack may change. So we still use Rails at Vidyard, but lots of new projects are in Node. So I'd say we're kind of split between those and then a couple other languages. So it's a bit of an investment trying to get your code into upstream, especially if there's no promise that you're actually going to be consuming it down the road. So I've got a link to the GitHub pull request, and you guys can take a look at it. And then just my final thought when I was coming up with the presentation was that hopefully like you guys will come away with a message that, yeah, it's awesome to go compress your code, but the real thing is just having great code and great developers in the community. And then we get more investment, there's more businesses, there's more developers, then you can have more groups like this, you can just have more conversations, more opportunities. And I don't know where I heard this from, but someone said we're in the golden age of social programming. I'm like, yeah, we are. Sure. GitHub's a great tool for just sharing your code and getting feedback, iterating on something. So yeah, I don't know. I don't think there's ever been a better time to be a developer, and I think if everyone keeps on doing what they're doing, KW is going to be a really great place to be a developer in the future. Mm-hmm. That's all I got prepared for you guys.
Soon you'll be in the Rails contributors list with the Rails code.
I'm less and less hopeful that that's going to happen, and I think what they probably would really like is for me to just go through the whole stack and say, this is where we're creating like gzip files, let's create a Brotli file here. That would be a lot of work. So basically for me it was just go check and see if the Brotli file exists, and if it does, then I can return it. And even with that, I think I wrote something like 10 specs. to go through and make sure it's like throughout the entire pipeline would probably be like a month or two of work. So definitely a harder sell to my manager. And again, there's other things I think I'd probably rather work on.
So you have your code reviewed before they accepted it?
So we could bring up the thread on GitHub. So they looked over it, and I looked at the style of how other people were writing their messages, and they're just like write a tiny like introduction, like why are you submitting this? And so I said like, you know, gzip's kind of on the way out. Brotli's a lot more popular. People are starting to use it. And one of the maintainers gave me a thumbs up on the comment, so I got some traction there.
Yeah, the first reply is like, we're super excited about it. And then,
well, so the way it works is you get an auto reply from a bot.
Oh,
it's like,
bot response.
Yeah. Sheen has been assigned to your pull request.
No, I think there was a human super in there somewhere that came either right after the bot or right before the bot.
What is your author? Edward Hall. Ryan Edward Hall?
Yes. Yeah.
Shows how much I work with you. Right?
Oh, it is RailsBot. There you go. Rails team is excited to review your changes. Yeah, that's.
So I thought they were excited, and then a lot of time goes by, and eventually someone was like, "Hey, like this is kind of neat," and then they're like, "Well, worried about overhead," and then they're like, they spotted an issue with my code, where I don't think I set the very header, and then I'm like, okay, I'll patch this up, and then. Yeah, more silence. That July date is wrong.
Yeah.
And,
Did you rebase?
yeah, because I think I did an amend, and so it's like that's probably the date of the original pull request. But I don't think that matters. I think they just have over 700 pull requests, so to think that yours gets, you know, more than like 1 or 2 glances. Probably a little naive. And again, it also has to do like, what are they concerned with? What are they working on? And then sort of the politics aspect of it.
I think maybe, as you said, like if your pull request is something that is simple enough that it's obviously easy for someone to go, yeah, no problem. But if it's something where someone looks at it and they're like, yes, but what if you did it this totally other way?
Their comment was, no one really goes in this code anymore, and it's a little sensitive, so
yeah.
They were probably kind of hesitant there to say, yeah, let's like upend how we serve static assets. That was probably the original code that was written. I mean, you could actually go into the Git history and look into that.
Yeah. So what exactly was your code doing? To me, it sounds like a no-brainer. This should be the top of everyone's mind if you're making something that, you know, like Brotli is this popular standard that's out there, huge support for in clients and stuff like this. Like Rails is a web server. Why are they not more interested in it?
Yeah, I think it's probably that it's something they'll do in the future. That's what I thought when I wrote the code. Like, so all I did was just say, like, look in this folder, see if the compressed asset exists, and let the server return it.
Yeah.
So it's not really anything complicated. And Brotli's open source, so there's no licensing issues. So it probably boils down to, like, manpower and willpower. And one of those two is probably lacking in this situation. And there is minuscule overhead in every single request saying, like, do I have a compressed version? Okay, do I have a gzip version or a Brotli version?
Right.
And probably very few people would have Brotli version until it's like fully adopted from the Rails pipeline. So again, that if they're really worried about performance, then maybe that'd be a good reason to say no.
Sorry.
You could just take the code that I have in the gist and you're off.
Okay, yeah, fair enough.
Or do something like have your static asset served by Nginx. Or something we started doing is uploading our static assets to S3, and then that's just mirrored by our CDN.
Yeah.
And that solves a lot of issues where if you're in the middle of deploying new code, the sort of limbo area where your server's like, this is the static asset, and someone is like, well, I just rebooted with the new code, and that's the static asset. So you could have the situation where it points to a bad asset for a very short period of time. But if it's all exists on S3, it's always there. So it's just a problem that goes away. Which is ultimately why this code isn't even used anymore.
Yeah, so as you were saying, those things it could be that the part of the reason they're not accepting is the actual solution you want to do is just get rid of all this code, and here's the list of other solutions you use for serving static things, and don't have it actually pass through the Rails middleware at all, because you probably shouldn't.
But then the argument is like, well, then should they stop doing it for gzip as well?
Well, that's what I would wonder, maybe.
And
that's what I wonder, might be
yeah.
the next question, which is too big for them to do here.
Well, actually, if you go into like the boilerplate application config, there's a Boolean like serve static assets true false.
Yeah.
So they do make it very easy to turn off. So there could be probably more docs around there, but like alternatives.
Yeah.
I don't think it really slows you down too much, but
yeah.
When you were talking about Fastly and how they can automatically do the gzip stuff if you use a static asset and the browser supports gzip,
yeah.
they plan to support Brotli the same way?
So what I've heard on that is that implementing these sorts of changes on a cache at their scale is not a very simple operation. And so that's why it's not like Brotli's out and then overnight they're like, we now do Brotli. So I imagine there's some truth to that. They do make it possible, and I kind of like the way it works now, where it's like, it'll just look at accepting coding, and it'll say, okay, I'll fetch the Brotli, or we've already created a gzip version, but it'd be interesting if they did. I think they should. Gzip is completely ubiquitous, though. Like, you have to consider things outside the browser as well. Like, there's lots of things like curl, or like Postman, or just other applications, and they don't necessarily support Brotli. So, generally speaking, browsers do, but I don't know about like the world at large.
You use the reference code of Google to write the code
for
Rails?
Link to the Brotli repo?
Yeah.
I didn't link to it in my PR. It should be on GitHub. I can't say that I've actually looked at it. So to my point earlier, I said like, how many of us like just use code as a black box and aren't concerned about the internals of it? I think there probably are certain things where you really should look at the internals, like when NPM had that like left pad fiasco. Yeah, why were you importing that? At some point in time, you do have to trust other people, and when a company like Google says we've got this compression tool, I'm inclined to say I'm willing to take your black box and use it, and that line is going to be different for everybody.
So they don't have the code open source?
They do. It is.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I just don't know where, but it is available online. It's not too different than the way gzip works. So some of the things are like variable window size, where I think gzip has like a fixed window size, and just a whole bunch of other optimizations that when you like collectively add them together, you just get your little performance boost. But the thing is, when you're at Google scale and you're handling that many requests, it quickly turns into tens of millions of dollars. So pretty easy for those engineers to justify working on it.
And especially if you're Google, you're in control of Android, you're in control of Chrome. So you can put this new standard on a lot of browsers and all your backend.
Yeah, use it before it's even its specification.
Yeah.
So what they're doing with a lot of stuff, right?
Yeah, there's a new Microsoft now.
It's hard not to be Microsoft when you get as big as Google is.
The JS implementation. That releases Bazel as a build system, which is interesting. It's a monorepo.
So you have to write some tests for your stuff?
Yeah, if you go in to the PR, you can look at all the files I changed. They're pretty thorough. I was impressed by the Rails project, just the scope of their testing. They test everything, and I think when you got a code base of that size, it's kind of irresponsible not to. So, like that's largely the PR. It's just that static RB file, and the rest of it is just tests. I only have 3 tests. Or I guess I probably have a bunch of asserts. Assert equal content very, So at the end of the day, it's not a lot of work to bring in, but again, it is about targeting performance. I really recommend people go into that first Google article I linked to. They've got a whole section on performance tips for web. So it doesn't just apply to your JavaScript, it's sort of the stack as a whole. Worth your time to read it over.
I guess it sounds like they express turning on compression is almost always free, almost just about a free performance gain.
Yeah. If you're doing it for a static asset, I would argue that it is free. When it comes to real-time requests, it's just about free because the time if you can compress faster than it'll take to send the uncompressed asset over the wire, that's a win.
Almost instantly better. Would you ever consider turning this into or pulling the middleware out into its own gem? If they weren't going to eventually patch it into Rails?
I can probably not, just because of how we've changed doing things here, putting things on S3. It just turned into actually more of config stuff with Fastly. So they have varnish files. So Fastly is a CDN that's built off of varnish. And so they have a friendly UI for making some changes, but at the end of the day, it's compiled. And there's a couple hooks you can use to be this is my incoming, or this is the response from the back end, and you can do things like set headers. And so I went through this whole exercise of making this pull request. And then at the end of the day, the solution didn't involve any of the Ruby code, and just was varnish files.
I guess the reason that this code hasn't been touched for a while, and why they might feel not super motivated to do it, because as soon as anybody gets past the development stage, they're not gonna run their static things. Their static assets through Rails. They're gonna do it exactly like you did.
Yeah. So I think the advantages of using Rails is more for the ease of handling routes with your controllers, and really verbose support for models. But at the end of the day, when it comes to stuff like assets, people are using Webpack or Browserify or Grunt, and Rails doesn't have to be as holistic a solution as maybe traditionally.
Yeah.
Although it is really nice if you're just trying to get your startup off the ground. Yeah, why not?
Yeah. Yeah. But then again, as you said, the fact that Webpack is in Rails.
Webpack
5.
Yep. 5.1, I think it was.
Yeah. So I guess that could be yet another reason that if you got as long as Brotli support is in Webpack, then maybe you can completely ignore it.
Well, if it's in Webpack, then like if they bring in Webpack and they're using it to do stuff like the compression, well then maybe you want your app to serve those files. So I don't know.
Yeah.
It's a mixed message.
Yeah, that's true. I guess again, they might even do the same thing as like you're supposed to just take your web packed up assets and stick them on your CDA.
Yeah,
and
maybe they
does
would.
that.
And I'm not sure, but I think we do it as a Webpack step to upload to S3. Yeah, Regan says yes.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Do you get any feedback, people that are enthused about using this?
No. It's really like me in the office just being like, hey guys, we need to compress everything with Brotli, and then they're like, make a pull request, we get supported upstream, then we don't have to worry about maintaining it. So I don't know, when I was asked to like give a presentation, I'm like, oh, I could talk about Brotli, maybe these people would be interested in it. I think anytime anybody goes into middleware, they're gonna come out with a story about it. So those are always fun to share.
Yeah. And digging into the Rails magic is always good too, no matter what. They do so many things to make it work relatively easily on the outside that getting into it is going to be something interesting.
What your experiences with open source been?
I'm curious. The
Which one are you referring to?
Any of them?
Oh god.
just a lot of people asking for things without any sort of consideration.
Sort of. No, it's more the one that I'm thinking of that I think you're referring to is the Docker sync fiascos.
Could be that one. You can do that one.
When we first moved with our Docker here internally, we were using Docker on Macs because everyone here at Macs, this is new compared to. So we were using Docker for Mac, and there were a lot of file sync issues between what was running in the virtual machine for what Docker was running in and what was on your actual Mac. And so in order to get faster changes into the container, what someone did was someone built basically an rsync that would sync from your Mac to the file system in the virtual machine and then mount the containers locally from the virtual machine rather than trying to do this weird file mounting stuff. Which tended to be a lot slower, and sometimes would miss file changes because they didn't propagate notifications properly from OSX to virtual machine. So, I mean, it was an interesting project, but then of course it was built by one guy, and I think he's French, which meant that it was like a different time zone. So when I would submit a PR, like there was always a conversation that went around like what was the motivation for it, but then also like, okay, can we make it something more generic? Can we make it like support all these other use cases, which is fair. And then I build those out, we put management merges, and then we try to figure out like release schedule for like the negotiations of like, okay, I want to use this internally, but you're the one who's publishing this. Can we at least like make a version bump or something, and like going through the arguments of like, can this be an alpha build? Like, can we get it on there so that I can get people to download it? And then a lot of times that people would create issues or pull requests themselves that are related somewhat tangentially to my code, or just aren't, and we'll ask if I can help them with their setup, because clearly I know what I'm doing.
You demonstrated your
Yes, yeah, exactly. Yeah. That was my first mistake. Yeah. So no, I mean, it's like you mentioned, it's like the community at that point goes around and supports it. Like I haven't made a PR to Docker sync in ages, mostly because like I don't use it anymore, but also because Docker for Mac upped their game a bit and did some improvements to the awesome stuff. So yeah, at that point now it's in the community standards, and he's taken it further and gone elsewhere with it, I think. So yeah, we don't use it internally anymore either. It was actually a big celebration for us when we pulled it up in repos. Because it involves setting separate files, and if you somehow got the container running but not the sync container running, or vice versa, where the Docker sync process was running but the container wasn't, you got all sorts of weird issues.
I think I got so fed up, I'm installing Ubuntu.
Yeah.
That was definitely the prompting for a lot of people to switch over to Linux, was the better support for Docker.
That's what got us to get to CentOS 7 instead of CentOS 6, because CentOS 6 Docker support is just atrocious. So
Yeah.
time to move.
I think most of us internally run Arch actually.
Yeah, there's one person like Landry who uses.
I'm on Brotli as well right now.
Okay.
Well, you do. Oh no, you don't really boot into Mac.
Yeah, I don't go into SX except for printing because printing in Linux.
I ask people with Mac installed to just print for me.
Printer drivers. I managed to get the printer drivers on here, and half of the documents print correctly, and the other half don't print properly at all.
It's just I can't be bothered. For the little amount of printing I do, I don't want to install cops and go through that headache. So.
There's always that problem with printing. It feels like nowadays we've gotten to a point where it's like you do it just often enough for it to be a pain to go like, right, how does this work again? Okay. But not to solve it completely because you know, okay, I've got this printed. I'm not gonna do this again for 6 months to a year. Whatever.
Yeah. Were you referring to that open source or the UDS stuff?
Probably that. That was a more interesting story, I think.
Your
UDS stuff isn't even open source yet, right?
No, we want to release it, but it's not. We want to test it in-house before we're comfortable saying, like, this actually works.
Yeah.
Rather than being like, this is great. Oh, shit.
So what is EDS?
The UDS, the Unix main socket stuff.
Use it, huh?
Yeah, we use Datadog. We use Datadog internally for some of our metrics and also for some of our log solutions. So one of the ways that you can get metrics off of the box is to have an agent running on the box, and then you can send metrics over UDP to a local port that's listening on that. But our infrastructure is such that getting the address of that local port to resolve properly is not always the easiest thing to do. And so Unix domain sockets allows you to, as long as it's on the same box and you have a path to the socket file, then we can just bypass the entire network stack. So that was attractive. Also, by going through the same box rather than like using, say, a forwarder that's like central, that like it's more easy to resolve in the networks thing. Then when the agent's on the box itself, it adds extra tags to your metrics before it sends it off the box, like saying what box it came from, what cluster it's in, that kind of stuff, which is helpful for like tracking down the metrics. If there happens to be like a spike of errors, you can sort of tag it better if you know, like, oh, they're all coming from one host.
Yeah.
Let's just shut that down.
So destroy.
Which happens. So it's very attractive for us to just get like a little bit of extra tagging support without having to do much extra work for it. But us having switched over to like a node-based stack for some of our projects, there was nothing that supported sending metrics to a UDS, like to Unix domain socket. So I was like, how hard could it be? A few weeks later, it's done.
Well, I mean, I think, for example, like doing this, the process of actually getting something through all the stages of getting a PR that's actually building and like ready to merge, whether or not they merge it, even going through all the steps of not just here was my idea, but like I actually did all the busy work to make it actually work. Is impressive and probably valuable.
I'll tell myself that.
I know it's not a great consolation when the PR is just sitting there and the motivation for
everyone
merging
has
is low.
PRs that go through that though, and like I'm sure most of us here have stuff that
Still open.
Yeah, it's still open, or it's like they're like we're closing this because we just don't see like a line to getting this in, and but if it's a good idea, it'll come back to life down the road.
Yeah, someone just merged one with Postgres 9 months. Took 9 months, but it got in. It's the tiniest thing ever, so it doesn't even count. But but I don't even use the software anymore. Again, like things change so quickly. You change your stack, you change your programs you're using, and it's like, oh, cool. I guess someone else will benefit from that.
Well, I think that was so. One thing I was imagining with, or when I was talking with Regan about it. So we talked about doing workshops occasionally, and so interleaving them with presentations. And one of the things I imagined was so we could go into Rails and work on the issue triaging, the PR triaging. I think I remember people talking about that happened a couple of years ago.
I feel like Rails is too big of a project to just do that. You'd have to choose something smaller, right?
Maybe. Because I think, was it Klavnik went in and triaged, like, sometime when he started in Rails, 4 or 5 years ago. I think that was supposedly what he did first, and just triaged a whole bunch of stuff because it got really bad. I wonder if that's the same thing that can make ourselves useful, but yeah, it might take a while to build up to that.
I mean, what I find is feasible is to just answer people's questions, not necessarily make the PR for it because you're not the expert of that code base or whatever, but being able to person's like, hey, this isn't working, and here's my stack trace, and you're like, well, let's go find out how to reproduce it, because they don't even know how to reproduce it, right?
Yeah.
And so just doing that is achievable without actually going the extra mile of actually knowing how to fix it.
Yeah.
Right? So when the maintainer gets there, they can be like, oh, okay, it's here, and I happen to know the supply. It's okay, yeah, cool.
Yeah, I totally agree. Half the time you hear when the comments read isn't the person that brought up the issue, it's the person that spent 5 hours finding the minimum reproducible use case.
Exactly.
They are the hero. Not the person that fixed it. No.
Yeah, exactly. To have the political clout and knowledge of the whole the culture of the project and all this is that's for maintainers. I'll just jump in and give them my time will just be figuring out how to make their lives easier in terms of when they get to this problem that they'll see exactly what is wrong and not just
it's broken. Issues are solved by just looking at GitHub issues. You can actually use people's forks of their code base.
That's true too. Yeah, someone else has played around.
Some things are less supported. Done that in the past.
Oh, so actually, that font gem I was talking about. Someone was talking about a problem in their issues, and I responded, and it's haven't gone through all of that, and I'm like, this is why your thing is never gonna work. And no one's commented on it since then, so maybe I've solved that problem for the world.
Yeah, you've created the thing that someone will be Googling one day.
Denver Coder 66. What did you see?
Exactly. Well, it's simple like Stack Overflow, right? You put things out there and you never know if someone's going to see it, but one day someone will upload it and you're like, what?
It'll hit the same weird sets of conditions that you happen to hit, and if you explain what you did, then that'll be good.
Yeah. That's why we would do what we do.
Yeah. So you said the font assets gem is not really widely used anymore? So
No, I don't think so. It didn't look like it received any attention for the last couple of years. And I think a lot of people are just using web fonts these days anyways. Although,
true.
yeah.
Was it? Oh, so it was packaging up your TrueType font or something.
Yeah,
So you can actually
I'm
serve
not
it.
actually sure what we were using it for.
I
So
think it's saying course headers or something.
Yeah.
Something super weird, and I don't even know why.
yeah, from what server?
It's wait, what?
Yeah.
I didn't fully understand what it was doing. It's just there.
So yeah, Vidger has a whole bunch of repositories. I think we've got 100, 150 or something.
160 at least.
So when I made this pull request, it's I was going into a project that I hadn't really touched in a year or two, and then mucking about some sensitive code in it. So that's kind of why it's font assets. So we don't need that. We'll just pull that gem out entirely. After talking to a couple people, are yeah, we could probably do that. Just pull it out. I don't think we need it.
Yeah.
Apparently we did.
Yeah, I deleted it once because I didn't see any references to the code, and then it was just oh, several days later after our font cache got busted, all our fonts broke, and all right.
Magic and more magic.
Yeah, it was because that gem integrated with the middleware, so I didn't see any of the integration at all. It was just there. which was kind of annoying actually.
Yeah. But like depending on what you're doing, you might not need to go all the way through the middleware stack. And so it's like less of a performance hit for pulling something in. And again, like it was looking for action dispatch, which is like the first or one of the first couple things that is typically in the middleware stack. So it's like barely even like doesn't really enter your application for the server to respond.
It is an interesting problem of, so when you go to try to play with a particular gem, like see if either to improve it because you use it or whatever, like see if they'll do another thing. It is an interesting problem to then figure out, like, yeah, should we still be using this gem? Is it maintained? Should we actually be using some other gem that's more actually maintained now? Or has this technique become basically obsolete and we should be doing this in an entirely different way? That's a challenging problem. I hope you don't figure that out after you've already written a large PR. It's like, oh, I'm going to totally improve this gem. It's going to be great. It's like, oh, nobody uses this.
All industries need to go in.
Yeah.
That's kind of the job of being a programmer, though. It's like constantly relearning how to do your job.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's true. Well, would you do another Rails PR?
Maybe. It wasn't a terrible experience.
Yeah.
It was fun to work on.
You got a response really quick.
Yeah. So when I got like an actual email saying like a real human has commented on it, like that was really exciting. But then it's like more nothingness. So it's like set your expectations accordingly. There's someone who works on Salesforce stuff here, and like Salesforce community takes your PRs and like will merge it 3 days later. So it's every project's different. Rails just probably a little slower.
Yeah, I guess it's not, I guess unlike Salesforce, it's not anybody's exactly their product. It's the thing that they use to build their products, but Rails itself is not. Nobody's getting directly paid to take in the whole list, I guess.
I don't know how they operate. Like I assume like based on donation.
Some of the larger companies sponsor it, GitHub does.
Shopify. Does Shopify have?
Shopify has a few core developers.
Rails or Ruby?
On Rails.
Rails. Okay.
I think Ruby. No, I'm not sure about Ruby. They did a bunch of mRuby stuff a year or two ago. I don't know about actual core Ruby.
Okay. Yeah, so it's Rails that they're at the core people of, I've been listening to a podcast called Request for Commits, and it's over now. It's only 20 episodes or whatever, a couple hours long, but it's two people. One of them is high up in the Node, like the Node project, and this researcher. It's the Node project guy and the researcher, and they just chat with people about open source sustainability and like all the aspects of like building a community or funding or anything that's related to keeping a project going. And it's kind of interesting if you're interested in that topic, which sounds like some of those. So, yeah.
Open source funding is an interesting problem. Like you see Webpack with their collective funds that Vue has a bunch of backers behind it. Mm-hmm. React. React's more company funded though, less than OpenMeeting.
React was the one that was at Facebook.
Oh yeah. Actually, I think it was Instagram that built it. They just got bought by Facebook. So.
That actually brings it up in my books.
Wait a second. Yeah.
And then you have like the Angular, which has been like lovingly curated carefully by Google and has never had a schism.
And Polymer.
Wait a minute, didn't Google make their own schism in Angular? I thought
Yeah,
that was the joke.
That's
Yeah, Angular wanted to 2. I think half the people out there are still on Angular 1.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it sounds like it was based almost just about a different library.
It was,
between 1 and 2.
yeah. It's like Python had like 2 to 3,
Yeah.
and it could help you port. It's like the two, like Angular 1 and Angular 2 are so radically different. There's no hope. Like I worked at D2L for a short period of time, and my project, I'm gonna write this with Angular. They're stuck with that now. Angular, yeah, 1.17 or something. Interestingly, today I had written something in Preact, which is like a small version of React, and then talked with the team at length, and they're like, we want it to be moved to React, and I effectively did it in a day. So there's some libraries you can go between. So
I mean, you were intentionally not like straying away from certain things anyway, right?
So well, Preact does this like implicit reference to the DOM object called this.base, and that doesn't really exist in React. React has like references, but doesn't always return the DOM object. Sometimes it'll return a React class, which is similar but different. Same.
But still.
It's just a thing we say, and
It's so funny when they announced React. I was watching the guy who invented it, and they presented at the conference. Everyone was saying, it doesn't make sense. It's nuts. As this you mix HTML with JavaScript plus this, yeah. So it's interesting how it evolved, and it looks like for legacy projects to maintain them, React is pretty good because you can modularize things, and to do the transition, if you have a legacy project and you want to transition to React, you can do like a small modules.
yeah, it's pretty easy to pick up. Like conceptually, it's pretty simple. I think often it's like you'll see React, Redux, and people want to use the two together. And for our purposes internally, I think Redux is the more important of the two. But I do really like just the lifecycle idea of React, and it's like pretty simple to just make a React class. You've got a component, you can drop it anywhere. And I was really sketched out originally by the idea of having your HTML and your JavaScript together, but in practice, JSX is really, it's fun and it works. And when I started doing it, thought it was going to be problematic, and it's actually just simplified a lot of things. So it depends a lot on your editor too. Like I use VS Code, and it won't complain. It's more than happy to let you write JSX, and it'll give you proper syntax highlighting. So why not?
Yeah, Microsoft these days integrates everything, yeah. So people don't complain, yeah. And surprisingly how VS Code, it's so successful because it's available on all platforms right now.
Yeah, and like we were talking about earlier, a quarter of the dev team uses Linux. So it's kind of strange to be on your Linux box installing a Microsoft code editing tool, but it's nice.
Heard the integration's great.
Yeah, their little application store too, and
I tried it I was looking for a new editor, so I tried Atom, and I was like, yeah, Atom's pretty cool, yeah. Because before I was using Notepad++, for basically everything. Atom's pretty cool, yeah. It's kind of slow though, and I'm like, okay. And my friend goes, well, try VS Code, it's brand new. Okay, I tried it, and night and day, just instantly, okay, I'm done with Atom, VS Code forever now, and so I just love it. It's great. Highly recommend if anyone's.
In the same vein, Electron 3 just released.
Oh yeah, that's true. I saw that.
Oh yeah.
So we'll see what happens now with all the Electron apps. Slack. It's good.
You know why VS Code is so good? because one of the founder members of the team is the guy in the Gamma of Django 4 with the design patterns, the book. So I saw a video with him when he was saying, Microsoft said, forget about patterns and everything. This is your because it's so nimble, and it's not like
that sort of thing, where they change their we're not trying to get you into the Microsoft ecosystem. You will get into it because you're using our tooling and it's awesome for all everything you do.
We'll crush you and take all your money from the inside.
Yeah, exactly. It is a much nicer approach to the whole thing, right? And they're a very different company than they used to be.
Is it embrace, extend, extinguish?
That was their old.
That was their old thing, yeah.
It was an official slogan.
It was on some internal documents, though.
Yeah.
So, yeah. A very different company.
Yeah, I don't know. The fact that they changed that also, I guess it's the same with any large company. You always know they're necessarily, like, the people who are at the top can change completely over time. So if they've done that change, they can always do another change in the future if they saw the money flowing in a different direction.
Yeah, it still took them 10 years or whatever to transition. So we're good for another 10 years, right?
I like that. You trust Microsoft for 10 more years.
Yeah, I think that's it.
And then you go back to Google again.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe they'll be not evil again.
But now their main source of revenue is the cloud, Azure. That's everybody realized the advantage, So
that's true. That does make things different.
Yeah.
I guess in the end, if they are actually, they do seem to be like open sourcing a lot more of their stuff. I guess that does make it a little bit different too, because it makes it harder for them to go backwards. It's like, oh, we just close everything up and take it all away. It's like, oh, okay, no.
It's out there now.
Not going to work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No problem.
You remember how you released it? Yeah.
It's on the internet. You can go.
Yeah.
Can't delete it anymore.
Well, what was it with Facebook and React? They wanted to change the license.
Oh, yeah.
And it was like really sketchy. Like, we will effectively own your code or something.
It was with patents and
Copyrights.
Yeah,
Yeah.
ESD plus patents was what they were trying to call it, right? But
It's like, no, the motivation is to be more open. Yeah.
backpedal.
But yeah, they backed
Or
up on it and they managed to change they managed to relicense it, which is like a feed in and of itself, right? Like,
That was after WordPress is like, we're reconsidering using and you power like 8% of the internet.
yeah, but I mean, and like more recently that one library, I didn't know of it, Lerna, yeah.
Oh yeah.
Tried to change their license to be like, you can use it, it's open source, unless you have a contract with the American Immigration Agency or whatever, right? And
yes.
right, because they didn't like what immigration in the States is doing, which I mean, fair enough, but like, but then the whole community was like, fuck no, we're not. You can't use a license like this. This is not open source, right? Like, one of the tenets of open source is that it's free for everyone for any use. It's not, you don't get to pick and choose who you think the bad guys are today.
Yeah.
And so it got rolled back. So I mean, the community is successful at a little bit at policing itself, which is nice.
I put my hobby code up under MIT, just as the nice thing to do.
Mm-hmm. It's an easy. Well, it does feel like like basically you can MIT or GPL.
Yeah.
Pick the one you want. You don't have to think about it very much harder than that.
Yeah, I was wondering about that because I think MIT has the one. Is MIT the one that has the questions around patents still? Like patent usage. There's one of those ones.
I think the Apache version 2 is basically MIT, but with some extra patenty stuff
Yeah, I think that's
on it. So that could be. 'Cause I guess the MIT license itself is pretty short.
It's very short.
That's part of the
Which is why I like it so much. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's also the WTFPL, which is like whatever the fuck you want.
Yeah, it's like nothing in court.
Yeah, that
so,
was-
so rock solid in front of a lawyer, I'm sure.
For sure. Sorry, say that again. I'll hold you in contempt.
So I like that. We can't test this in court because before we say the name of the license, we're held in contempt of court.
That'd be interesting, eh? Put like, yeah, put like some sort of, well, yeah, there's ways around that, yeah.
Oh, does anybody else have any more questions? Thank you very much for the start with. Sorry we didn't have a larger turnout for you,
Yeah,
but
that's all right.
If
It's
you would
fun.
like to try this again, or if you'd like to present something else that you come across, I'll try not to screw up the location quite so badly and at the very last minute.
No worries. Yeah, this was fun.
Cool.
They don't really get out anymore. You get the little guy at home, so
Yeah, that's part of the reason I keep organizing this because it does the same thing.
yeah.
But so next week we're going to do sort of a quick workshop. I think my idea was that we'll do after we have a presentation that's kind of about a chunk of code. Try out having a quick workshop night like the week before, so everything's fresh. So my original idea was that we'd look over your PR and then maybe branch out because it sounds like you don't need any extra feedback or help on your PR. But maybe branch out from there and like look at Rails middleware or other stuff, or use that as an excuse to go start playing and looking at the other Rails PRs.
If you want to see some weird stuff, those headers I was talking about, just give them bad values and you get some weird content.
Hook up AML to it, or
Yeah.
hook a fuzzer to it and have some fun.
There was an issue where one of the other devs was doing Brotli compression, but he wasn't sending the content type, and the browser just, I can't even remember because it was a few months ago, but we were like both like, I wouldn't have expected it to do what it's doing, and just strange rendering problems.
Interesting. Like things where you sort of would have expected would just say no, I can't do
You'd
that.
think,
That
yeah,
makes no
you would-
sense.
It was like,
Yeah, that was a pretty clickbaity title. You would never believe.
yeah, well, I will never remember. I think I repressed.
Yeah.
Nothing's worse than when someone's like, you're the subject matter expert, what's going on here? And you're like, I have no idea.
Give me an hour to refresh my memories and maybe I can tell you.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we'll do that next week, next Tuesday, 7 o'clock. There is, unless a ton of people RSVP, we'll go to the Settlement Co. It's just down at the corner of King and Victoria, so hopefully easy to access for anyone who wants to come. And then in October, we're going to try to do something similar, so do a workshop night that's kind of going and trying to play with Rails, so get the Rails build environment working, because I know I've never done that. Maybe getting Vagrant working, Docker, or getting Docker working, if that's whatever the right way for.
My demo repo has Docker working.
Oh yeah,
It's,
alright, so maybe Docker's the right way to do Rails now. We'll try to do that with the idea of then doing future workshops where like maybe we try to help with bugs or fix issues or open things or find whatever the, I think Reagan, you were saying that there's some easy introductory stuff that they claim is a way to get started in contributing.
maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know.
We can
I
find-
mentioned that. But
Yeah, or we can either find out that that's not true or that it is true. We'll see. And then in November, Craig Lehman from Shopify wants to do a presentation, but he hasn't given me the topic yet. He was one of the people who was doing work on mRuby for Shopify, but I think he was sort of done with that project, so that was not what he was working on now, so he didn't want to present on it. That's it. And yeah, and we got I've got a bunch of people, Myovision. Oh, I can't remember the name of the other company. Applied Board. Myovision, Applied Board, someone else from Shopify. We're sort of getting lined up for next year. So that'll be stuff. And then and we'll try to continue the same pattern, like do a presentation, then do a workshop night, do a presentation, do a workshop night. So hopefully we can sort of make this both the chance for people to tell us about the cool things they've done, but then also a chance for anybody who wants to start trying to contribute things or try to build something to just come and like try to maybe build something that you wouldn't do in your day job, or take have an hour or two to go and try to do a Rails issue that you might not have time to do at work, but you're going to do it. And then eventually you can slowly commit to work to set aside more time for doing these things anyway. Slowly. Yeah. Cool. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Kim, for taking care of the hosting.
Brings the door.